Right.
The Sears company doesn't send stuff to the people who are in management at Penny's. At least we don't think they do anyway. And so if you get something that speaks that way, you have to tell us this about all your employees, then that person imagines that it means his workers, when really it doesn't. Or in many cases it doesn't. In some cases it does, of course. Some people do qualify as employees under the definitions of the law, but most don't. And so these presumptions occur. And even people who are specialists in this area, even tax attorneys, CPAs, human resources people in big businesses and so forth, they don't know about these definitions, and they never look. Most of them don't even know that it's their responsibility to go to the trouble of finding out whether or not there are special definitions being used. Again, in our American system of law, it's the responsibility of the actor to know their legal obligations and to know these things and to do the due diligence that's involved in finding these things out. And so these custom definitions are indeed a key source of confusion. Again, run through that short list of the very significant ones: trade or business. How many people imagine every time they ever saw something related to the income tax that referred to a trade or business that just meant somebody who had a company? Everybody thinks that, unless they've read my book or unless they've undertaken a study themselves to find out that trade or business is a defined term. It has the definition of performing the functions of a public office. Obviously, Joe's gas station doesn't fall under that definition. But if Joe's gas station the guy who owns Joe's got something referring to what everybody with a trade or business needs to do, he's likely just going to think that probably applies to him.
Sure, and
he's going to think that Joe's gas station is a business.
I was self-employed at the time that I purchased your book.
Yeah, there's another custom definition: self-employment.
Yeah. I'll tell you the truth though. The one definition though that really jumped out at me that when I talk to people about custom definitions, because I'm I kind of try and spread your message. Actually, any of my regular listeners here know that they've heard me talk about the same things you're talking about on multiple past shows. It's always better, obviously, to get it from the author. But the one word that always seems to get everybody when I tell them what the definition is, the word state.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, a state, in most places where it's defined in the tax law, it does not include the several states. It doesn't include Ohio or Michigan or New Jersey or New York. It refers to the U.S. possessions and territories in the District of Columbia. Although there are places where state has a broader definition. In fact, state is redefined in the tax law for purposes of various sections, and then there's also a code-wide definition, or broad definition as well. Many times, probably dozens of times. I've not done an exact count, but it's many times. And in most of the places that that count to most people, it's actually very narrowly confined to what might be called states of the United States. That is to say, states belonging to the federal government, as opposed to the states that make up the union.
Federal jurisdiction, you're talking about.
Yeah, that's correct. Two broadly different things, and you're absolutely right. It's important to recognize that distinction.
Now they multi-layer these custom definitions, don't they? They'll have a custom definition for a word like United States person or whatever the exact term is,
which will inside the definition of that term have another custom defined term, and sometimes yet a third as well. Yes, you're absolutely right.
That's insane.
Well, it's the law. It's law. Again, these things are not true exclusively of the Internal Revenue laws. These are fairly common elements of any body of law. It just happens that the Internal Revenue law is very voluminous. It's somewhat older than a lot of the law that most Americans end up having to have contact with or deal with, and so it's maybe a really good example of the excesses to which this kind of thing can be carried. Everyone is accustomed to thinking of Internal Revenue law as just a mare's nest, complete spaghetti, just incomprehensible, and it often is. It's often very, very quirkily written. but it's even more so when you know that there are these custom terms in there as well.
Maybe it's just my inner cynicism. I don't know, but after I read your book and I go back and I start reading sections of the Internal Revenue Code, I started saying to myself, this almost seems intentional. I mean, this is when you start multi-layering custom definitions when it could be so easily understood with the use of different wording that doesn't require any more print or any more pages. You say, why are they doing it this way? It seems it's done that way to intentionally confuse people.
Yeah, I've always had two minds about that subject. I've had that same suspicion, of course, because it does seem almost self-evident sometimes because of the way it's written. Other times, I recognize the way legal draftsmanship takes place, and we're talking about a body of law that has developed over the course of decades and decades. I mean, 140 years or so, a little more than that. Layer after layer after layer being put in place, and so to some degree that might be just completely inadvertent. But that said, when things like the definition of a term that is used in Section A will be found only in Section B, and Section B is 500,000 words away, then my hackles are raised yet again, and I get pretty suspicious about that.
Well, and you know what? I think the more educated people become on the subject, the more they'll have their suspicions raised about the way it's
raised
written.
and perhaps confirmed. And I certainly want people to do that education, and I want people to read Cracking the Code and get themselves free, because that really is what this is all about. We started out talking about the founders and the way they set things up, and they set things up this way for a reason. They meant for the federal government to be closely controlled, to not have the sort of power to destroy that an unlimited power of taxation represents. They wanted the people of this country to be able to maintain direct control over how much of their property was put in the hands of the federal government or made available to the federal government to be used for the various things that it gets used for. They did not intend, and they specifically prohibited an open spigot of money into the federal treasury of the kind that an income tax imposed on an ignorant population represents. And it is our, as an American people, it is our having dropped the ball, having abandoned our responsibilities that allows this to happen, and it very much to our own disservice. And,
well, we're going to take our final break of the hour here, and then, Pete, when we come back, we're going to run you right to the top of the hour. This stuff is great, and I hope the audience out there is really learning. Why don't you get over to Pete's website, www.losthorizons.com. You can buy the book Cracking the Code there, and we're going to get into donating to Pete's legal fund when we get back. Welcome back to Fighting Back here on WTBQ, 1110 AM, 99.1 FM. Pete Hendrickson, author of Cracking the Code, on with us today. Now, I had mentioned right before the break we were getting into Pete's legal defense donations. You have to understand that Pete is fighting a battle that doesn't just affect Peter Hendrickson. What Pete is doing out there affects the freedom of not only you, but your children, your grandchildren, posterity. It affects posterity. Now, every time Pete has to go to war against the IRS, which, let's be honest, it's a war, is it not, Pete?
Oh, it's absolutely a war.
Well, every time Pete has to go to war...
It's one that I'm pretty nearly the only one having to fight at this point.
Well, and I think that's because you're the only person out there threatening to actually expose the truth. The other
exactly
people
correct.
they're not on target.
That's exactly correct. Which isn't to say that there aren't other folks that are being harassed by the IRS, but in this particular case, their efforts are to suppress the distribution, the readership, and of Cracking the Code, and to frighten people into not acting on what they learn in the book, despite the fact that when people do act on what they learn in the book, the system responds lawfully to them in pretty nearly every case, and that's sort of a contradiction in reality that the IRS very much would like people to not be conscious of. But even as they assault me personally, they continue to make complete refunds to Americans across the country every week.